Human Rights Watch in D.C., Tom Malinowski says the administration could be taking steps to send a message to the people around Muammar Gaddafi.
The U.S. could, for example, impose targeted sanctions on the Libyan government. It could block banks from conducting financial transactions.
Some have suggested a no-fly zone could be imposed. Pentagon officials say the U.S. has the assets in the area, but they are not currently preparing to take to the skies over Libya. The State Department says getting international approval to take that step would be difficult. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And Al Jazeera's Rosalind Jordan has been following developments from the White House.
It was some of the toughest language yet to come from the Obama administration about the deteriorating situation in Libya. On Wednesday evening, U.S. President Barack Obama spoke to the world about how he views the situation inside Libya. He said he condemned the government's actions against its own people, whom he said were simply asking for their personal rights to be respected. President Obama then went on to say that he is sending his Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Geneva on Monday in order to meet with other members of the Human Rights Council. And another top State Department official is going to be traveling throughout the Middle East and Europe to talk about ways of convincing Libya to stop attacking its own people and to figure out ways of holding the Libyan regime of Muammar Gaddafi accountable. Some of the possible ranges of activities that could fall under this include imposing economic sanctions on the Libyan government, freezing the assets of Muammar Gaddafi, his family, and other top Libyan officials, perhaps establishing a no-fly zone or incurring some other sort of military action, as well as possible referral to the UN Security Council for some sort of possible sanction out of that body. The president stressed that this is not a matter of the U.S. having a problem with Libya or any other individual country. He said this is a matter of the international community condemning what he calls atrocities.
And the international community may have to impose a no-fly zone over Libya, according to the United Nations top human rights official. Nabe Pillay said the measure could be needed to protect civilians from attack by government aircraft. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has condemned the ongoing crackdown. Kath Turner reports.
The violence in Libya continues and Colonel Gaddafi is still clinging to power, and the world is looking to the United Nations for action.
The Security Council, as you know, is meeting today to assess the situation and determine whether there are steps the international community can and should take.
Would I like us to go further and have a full United Nations Security Council resolution? Yes, I would.
But at UN headquarters in New York on Wednesday...
Mr. Ambassador, any discussion about Libya today at all?
Sanctions? I haven't heard about that.
Morning, Mr. Ambassador. Any talk about sanctions on Libya today at all? Anytime soon?
The UN Secretary-General cut short a domestic trip and returned to New York for talks with his senior advisers on Libya. But when he emerged to talk to the media, Ban Ki-moon did not stray from his previous statements.
So there are calls in the international community, Mr. Secretary-General, for no-fly zones, for sanctions, and yet after 3 hours of negotiation, the Security Council came out with a statement, not even a presidential statement. Are you satisfied with that?
The situation is developing rapidly toward a very dangerous situation. Therefore, we need to very carefully monitor the situation. I will continue to urge in the strongest possible terms for us to stop violence, protect the human rights and the civilian population.
International frustration is growing over the United Nations' apparent lack of action.
Well, you have to get the political consensus first. That produces some words, and then from those words, hopefully, you get some real action.
The Security Council remained mute during the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. The governments collapsed with relatively little violence. The use of mercenaries and aerial attacks on unarmed Libyans has alarmed the international community, and yet the response from the Security Council may be similarly weak.
Understandably, a few members of the Council are quite cautious about invoking sanctions. Sometimes you don't know exactly who's going to be hurt and whether they're going to make a difference or not.
Several observers are calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate possible crimes against humanity. But its chief prosecutor says Libya does not recognise the ICC's powers. The only way it can step in is if Libyan authorities accept the ICC's jurisdiction or if the UN Security Council refers the situation to the court.
Kath joins us now. So these are the questions we keep hearing. Why next week for this next UN meeting, and why the UN Human Rights Council anyway? It's a pretty toothless body.
On why next week, but you could broaden it out and say this seems to be the kind of time that the UN takes with these sort of things. It takes the time. It takes 3 or 4 days to get their member states together in Geneva for the Human Rights Council meeting, which will be on Friday. There has already been some draft resolution released. It's similar language that we always hear from the United Nations, strongly condemns, strongly calls and urgently calls for. Now, there's already been reports that China, Russia and Cuba are fighting for it to be watered down even further. Seems to be a problem with a trend, I should say, with the United Nations bodies, as it was with the Security Council resolution as well, getting consensus on the words. So when we look at the options in front of the United Nations, Security Council or the Human Rights Council, we're looking at trying to get the consensus of member states, which clearly have competing interests. And we need to look at the relationships that the member states also have with Libya, be they diplomatic, be they business ties, and the relationships they have with each other. The vote or the resolution that may be voted on Friday will have, you'll be having about 140 states, African nations, some Asian nations, which have ties also with Russia and China, who have a veto power in the United Nations Security Council. So it's certainly not black and white, it's not cut and dried. These states that are voting on these resolutions end up being so watered down, so weak, and really no action taken when the international community is calling for no-fly zones and sanctions and tough measures to stop the violence in Libya. The United Nations will take days to get anything concrete, any meaningful action happening there.
So I only have 10 seconds, but do you mean Friday or Monday? I'm a bit confused about when this meeting's actually taking place.
The first one for the Human Rights Council, Shihab, is on Friday. There's a second one on Monday. That's the one that President Obama has sent Hillary Clinton to. She'll be actually talking to foreign ministers there. Sorry, thanks, Kath. Kath Turner at the UN. That's it for the moment from Washington. I'll be back a little later in this news hour with more, including a house divided by ambition, what leaked US diplomatic cables reveal about the Libyan leader's family.
Well, thanks very much, Shihab. Back to Shihab later. Muammar Gaddafi has always kept his family close, with his sons an integral part of his power structure. The most prominent is his son, Saif al-Islam. Now, many in the West came to see him as a reforming influence, but his dramatic appearance on Libyan television on Sunday night, defending his father, shattered many illusions. Barnaby Phillips reports.
He was the charming face of the Gaddafi regime, a man who loved art.
This kind of painting was the beginning of my journey with colors.
A man who wooed the world with talk of reform and the promise of access to Libya's wealth. So Saif al-Islam's rambling televised speech came as a shock to those foreign admirers. He said drug addicts, foreigners and Islamists were plotting against his father, who would fight to the last bullet. This is the London School of Economics, the LSE. Saif studied here, his charity has given it money. But academics who knew and liked him are now appalled by his speech in support of a brutal regime.
Here was a man, I think, under huge stress.